we're at the precipice of what's happening. And July of 2025 is like we're getting reverberations from the future that are like activating energies now, but they're not yet manifest fully.
Does it amplify the potential for a higher timeline, or does it just amplify the conversation itself?
The tension gets so great that it becomes irresolvable until all of a sudden the lightning strikes.
There is a war going on already for whose vision for humanity is going to win.
We're getting stuff from AI now that's hard to tell whether AI is artificial.
The future is still more malleable from this moment in time.
What can we do individually? Well, we can clean up our internal wars.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the Astrology Hub podcast. Today, we get to have Mr. Rick Merlin Levine here for a July forecast, which, Rick, I don't want to get too far into it right out the gate, but I just want to ask you a yes/no question.
Yeah, the answer is yes. You know me.
Okay. Would you agree that we are in the most intense period right now of 2025?
Yeah, defined period. I would say yes, we are, but I'm not sure that it's July. I think it's April, May, June, July, August. I mean, we are in, you know me, I'm always pushing the beginning and ending of things. I don't think July is the most intense month, but there's a lot going on. And I think the important thing to understand about July, obviously we have Uranus moving into Gemini that I know we'll talk about. But the thing about July is we're getting first glimpses of next year in June, July, August of 2026. And that's the important thing, because we now know from quantum physics that there's this thing called retrocausality, which is how the future impacts the present moment. That's a rabbit hole we can explore sometime, not now, but it's a very real thing. And it's almost like there's this invisible great attractor starting in July of 2026 that we're being drawn toward. And I think that in July of 2025, we're getting the first strong resonances to that period of time. So yes, I think it's very intense, but I mean, has there been a week that's not been intense in June? Or in May, or in April, for that matter, or maybe even since the beginning of the year? It's an intense period of time, and you don't need to be an astrologer to see that.
Yes. Okay, perfect. We will get into all of that. I love what you're talking about the future impacting the present and the present impacting the future and all that. That's very fascinating, Rick. And Pam Gregory recently called this period of time the rehearsal. Like we're actually in rehearsal for that 2026 period. So we're going to go into all of that.
Yeah.
Before we do, we are celebrating Astrology Hub's 10-year birthday
Go Astrology Hub.
in July. So Rick is going to be making a little contribution to it. We're going to have 10 days to celebrate 10 years of giveaways, raffles, gifts, all kinds of amazing things. And so every day is going to be something different. If you're not yet on our mailing list, you won't know what all these gifts are. So if you want to participate in the birthday party, go to astrologyhub.com/insider. Make sure you're on the list, and we'll make sure you're included in the celebration, which we would love to have all of you a part of. So that's enough for now. Rick, let's go through July. Tell us the highlights. If you had to choose a theme, what would it be? Can you do that now, or do we have to do that in retrospect at the end of
I
it?
kind of like Pam Gregory's rehearsal. I put the word dress rehearsal behind it, but we'll come back to it. I should know better going into these podcasts with you that I should think about all this stuff in advance, but somehow we always pull it out of the air somehow. But yeah, there's definitely a feeling of kind of reflection to the past and an anticipation of the future. You know, when you talked about how the future impacts the present and the present impacts the future, quantum physics demonstrates experimentally that it's even crazier than that, because the present moment actually alters the past. And that is, you know, we always think the past is written in stone, but the fact of the matter is that's why we do therapy. This
Mm.
is the value. One of the values of astrology is not just talking about what's going on now, but it's also changing or rewriting the past to become more truthful about what happened, so that we can then have more choices in the present moment, which then alters the future. That's why we do therapy, but that's also why we look at a chart and say, what happened when Saturn was doing this in your chart? Ah, and now it's doing this. Boom, we make a connection from the past to the present, which alters our understanding of the past based upon our present perspective. So, didn't mean to get sidetracked off of July, but here in July, we have so much dynamic change, and yet all the outer planets are turning retrograde. You know, this month we have, in order, we have Neptune turning retrograde on the 4th, Saturn turning retrograde on the 12th, Mercury, an inner planet, turning retrograde on the 17th, and then Eris is turning retrograde on the 22nd, and Chiron is turning retrograde on the 30th. And so there's this connection with things slowing down, even though there's a lot of events and a lot of things are happening. I mean, there is a high level of intensity that is still with us, carrying over from the last couple of months. And certainly by the events, you know, that were toward the end of last month of June. I mean, this is obviously a dynamic period of time, but there's also a beginning of a looking back to see what happened. But we're doing that in anticipation of what's ahead, as Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto have all either recently changed signs or are just, as in Uranus's case, just about to change signs. And of course, these changing signs of, in particular, Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto, are basically a wobble until next year, until next January, February, when Saturn and Neptune turn direct, and then they conjoin in on February 20th. And so what's happening now with Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus just moving into Gemini, we're getting this buzz of the air of Gemini. Uranus, and just to be clear, Uranus actually enters Gemini on July 7th, but Venus enters Gemini on July 4th. And so we're getting this Gemini buzz. In fact, we begin the month with Venus joining up with Uranus at the very, very edge of the last degree of Taurus. And then Venus goes into Gemini, followed by Uranus into Gemini. And the thing about their movement into Gemini, aside from what it means when a planet, or in particular Uranus, moves into Gemini, what's happening when Uranus moves into Gemini and Venus just prior to it, is that they're making sextiles with Saturn and Neptune in Aries at 1 and 2 degrees of Aries, and they're making a trine with Pluto at early degrees, at now 3 degrees of Aquarius, but retrograding back. And so we're getting this Uranus trine Pluto with Saturn and Neptune at the midpoint, sextile both of them on either side. And this is going to be the predominant exact fulfillment of 2026, when Saturn and Uranus are exactly conjunct at the end of February, and when Uranus makes its exact trine with Pluto later in the year in July, and that's the first of 5 trines it'll make from 2026, 27, 28. And so we're at the precipice of what's happening. And July of 2025 is like we're getting glimpses, we're getting inklings, we're getting reverberations from the future that are like activating energies now, but they're not yet manifest fully.
Couple things. First of all, can you back up a little bit and talk about the significance of all of these outer planets changing signs in a relatively short period of time? When was the last time this happened? What is the impact of that kind of mass movement from these outer planets? Why is it so significant?
Okay, first of all, whenever a planet changes signs, it's like it puts on a new costume. It puts on and it's, that dress for success. If you're wearing a suit versus holding, a skateboard and wearing cut off jeans, you're going to act differently. And so the planets, as they go into a new sign, kind of have a new identity. It's still the same character inside it, but it's expressing differently. And the slower moving planets change signs less frequently. For example, the sun changes signs once a month. The moon changes signs every few days. Pluto only changes signs once every 12 to 35 years. And so when Pluto changes signs, our antenna goes up because Pluto is a 248-year cycle, and Pluto has now changed signs from Capricorn into Aquarius that we've been talking about for 2 years or more, because it's wobbled back and forth, retrograded direct between Capricorn and Aquarius. And now Pluto is in Aquarius for the next, couple of decades. And it wasn't there. The last time it was there was at the founding of the country in the 1770s. On top of that, yes, the outer planets change signs less frequently. Saturn changes signs every 2.5 years. Neptune changes signs every about 7 years, every 14 years, and Uranus changes signs about every 7 years. There are years when they all seem to change within a year or two or three of each other, but this time it's completely different because they're all changing signs while making trines and sextiles to one another. And that makes the energy substantially different. And on top of that, one of the peaks in this whole period is that Saturn and Neptune, which join up like the sun and the moon join up once a month, Saturn and Neptune join up once every 36 years, roughly. That's a very regular cycle. It's, 2, 3 times a century. But they've never, as far back as at least a couple thousand BC, they've never done that at 0 degrees of Aries, which is an astrological key point. So while Saturn and Neptune are joining at 0 degrees of Aries, Uranus is making a sextile to it from one side, while Pluto's making a sextile to the other side of it, which makes this whole thing, I wouldn't say unusual, I wouldn't say rare. I would say any astrologer who says they know what this means can only extrapolate based upon their understanding of the symbols, but there's no history. I mean, we can look back and see that when Uranus has been in Gemini, there's been radical change, and sometimes that's been aggression or war. Uranus was in Gemini during the American Revolution. The next time it was in Gemini was during the American Civil War. The next time it was in Gemini was during World War II. Now, that doesn't mean that every time Uranus goes into Gemini, we go to war, because quite frankly, there's rarely been a time when the United States has not been at war. And obviously, the recent events, in the Mideast certainly are setting rumblings of this Uranus in Gemini. But like many astrologers, I think we have to, I think that there are a lot of people who are very fear driven and are saying this all means war and destruction and nuclear meltdown. And I'm a bit of a minimalist astrologer. It's as terrible as things might be for anyone at any given time. The planets keep going round. And, we can say, oh my God, we're on the edge of war. This is awful. If you live in Palestine, your life has been in meltdown for, if not generations, at least a couple of years. And there are we forget that there's many layers of complications and experiences of these planets. But I do want to say, and some other astrologers have made this point also, that we are at war, and the war is probably going to get more intense, but it's an information war. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be some physical spillage, and it doesn't mean that it won't get awful. I don't know. But any astrologer who says, oh, every time Uranus goes into Gemini, the United States goes to war, and therefore we're going to be in war, the Uranus has never gone into Gemini while it's trining Pluto and sextiling Saturn and Neptune. So, these are important considerations. And what does it mean? I'll let you know in a couple of years. But I'm willing to, what's the right word? Visualize some potential and possibility. And certainly Uranus, the planet of, when Uranus was discovered, like all the outer planets, it was thought to be the absolute worst thing ever. In fact, it was considered, when it was first discovered and looked at in charts, it was considered to be the planet of disaster and cataclysm. Period. There was nothing about creative genius or invention or breakthrough or aha, the awakener. It was just terrible. And that's true actually for all of the outer planets. Neptune, when it was discovered, was just considered to be psychosis and mental breakdown and deception and hallucinations and mental institutions. There's nothing about spirituality. We tend to look when Pluto was discovered, it was the planet of death, destruction, and mass fascism. Nothing about metamorphosis, transformation, evolution, And so the thing though is that when Uranus was in Taurus for the last 7 years, it basically releases pent up energy. That's what Uranus's job is. I've sometimes said in lectures, if you take only one note during this lecture, write this down. Uranus's job is the instantaneous resolution of irresolvable opposites. And of course, that in itself is impossible, because how can you resolve irresolvable opposites? But it works like this. If you imagine cold, dry air and it has a positive ionization, and it meets warm, wet air that has a negative ionization. Now, warm, wet air that's moving, the negative ions feel good. It's why we like being at the seashore. It's why Hawaii is chill. It's why we like being at a waterfall or sitting by a murmuring brook or taking a shower. These are all negative ion generators. Positive ions are like these dry winds that it was created by dry air moving. And there's a saying that says, an ill wind blows no good. And every area has their ill winds, whether it's the Sabras in Israel, or the Fen, which blow through Switzerland, or the Chinooks that come down from Canada, or the Santa Anas. I mean, these are all, they put us on edge. They're like flies and mosquitoes before a storm. It's like not okay. So back to my image, you got this positive charged cold air and this warm, negatively charged warm wet air. And as the two of them come closer together, they do what any psychologist would tell us to do if there was conflict. And that is, they talk about it. Now, they don't do it in English, but they try to work it out. And the more one rubs up against the other, the greater the positive becomes more positive, and the greater the negative becomes more negative. And it's like the more they talk about it, the greater the tension is. And the tension gets so great that it becomes irresolvable until all of a sudden the lightning strikes. That is how Uranus works. Uranus relieves the pent up tension that becomes irresolvable, and it smacks it into one and puts everything out in the open. When the lightning strikes, even if it's the middle of the night, all of a sudden we can see the rusty car parked down the road and the mountains in the background and the warehouse. We can see everything. And then it's black again and we can't see anything, but we know where it is. And so Uranus is called the Great Awakener. Although our friend Richard Tarnas, who wrote Cosmos and Psyche, wrote a book called Prometheus the Awakener. And in it, he suggests that Uranus was actually misnamed. He suggests and makes an excellent case for the fact that Uranus is basically Prometheus, meaning it brings the fire from the gods into the hands of humans. It's that snap awakener that gives us some new ability that we didn't have before. And Uranus is radical, it's revolutionary, it's rebellious. It doesn't fit into the scheme. It's other than normal. I call Uranus the quantum planet because it kind of jumps between that particle wave. You can't tell if you're a photographer and trying to photograph lightning, it can be a storm and there's lightning all over, but you can't aim the camera at the lightning because it always happens. You know that the lightning is going to strike, but you never know where and you never know when. And that's what Uranus's magic and job is, because it takes things that have been hidden and brings it out into the open, which is why sometimes there's actual physical war, because these things have been bubbling. You look at the issues of either, let's just say, the American Revolution or World War II or the Civil War, all with Uranus and Gemini. And again, we have to be careful because there are wars with Uranus in any sign. But in Taurus, Uranus has a hard time because Taurus doesn't like change. Taurus is, think granite. Taurus is solid rock. And so the changes that happen when Uranus is in Taurus happen more abruptly and less frequently, like earthquakes, like political upheaval. In Gemini, the changes are happening or will happen much faster and much more regular, and it might feel more disruptive at times. But remember, earthquakes only happen when the earth is stuck. If there's little movement day by day by day by day, then there is no earthquake. And from that standpoint, the results of a Uranus transit in a natal chart, or by transit to a natal chart, are often indications of how well we work with those things that don't fit in easily. And those people who have a life where there's something that's really hidden, really buried, that's when that lightning is going to strike loud enough that it's going to be, I hate Uranus. Every time I get a Uranus transit, my life turns inside out and upside down and backwards. And if you turned your life day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year, upside down and backwards in little pieces, then maybe the big ones wouldn't happen. So we have Uranus moving from Taurus, where it doesn't change easily, into Gemini. And Uranus's move into Gemini, remember, like Saturn and Neptune's move into Aries, they're moving into these new signs, they retrograde back, and then they go forward again. Now, we're focusing on Uranus just for a moment, but Uranus will move out of Taurus into Gemini for the first time since World War II. But it does that on July 7th. And then by November 7th, it retrogrades back into Taurus, where it will remain until next April, when it then moves into Gemini and stays in there for the next 7 years. So what we're getting when Uranus moves into Gemini, we're getting the first waves of what this larger 7-year process will be. Now hold that just for a second, because at the same time, we have Saturn having moved from Pisces into Aries back on May 25th, so the end of May. So it's been now, it's moving from Pisces into Aries. So Saturn has been in Aries now for a bit over a month. It's been in for all of June and, through the beginning of July. Saturn moved into Aries back in May, the end of May, and it then retrogrades and will move back into Pisces on September 1st. And it'll stay in Pisces until next February 13th. Now, here's the thing, is that right intermixed with this, we have Neptune having moved out of Pisces, where it was for 14 years, into Aries the end of March, the last of March. So Neptune has been in Aries now for April, May, and June. And it turns retrograde also this month, July 4th, on July 4th. And it retrogrades back into Pisces on October 22nd. Stays in Pisces until the end of January 2026. It moves back into Aries, and then at 0 degrees of Aries on February 20th, Saturn joins up with Neptune. So we have this dynamic shift going on. On top of that, Pluto, which is only 1 year into its new sign of 20 years where it'll be. And so all these outer planets, which are all talking to each other because they're sextile and trine one another, that there's definitely communication going on between this evolutionary ending new beginnings of Pluto, the transformation, the caterpillar becoming the butterfly in Aquarius, the sign of the community, the sign of humanity, the generalized larger scheme of things. And into that, we have Uranus making its first trine by sign as Uranus moves into Gemini on the 7th. It'll still be 2 or 3 degrees away from being exact, but Gemini to Aquarius is air to air. And so for the first time since their conjunction, which defined the 1960s, the 1960s was defined by the astrological conjunctions of Uranus and Pluto in 1964-65. And so in a way, this is that coming to a flow energy rather than a constriction. In fact, in the 2010s, Uranus was square Pluto, and we saw all the dynamics of the 60s, whether it was civil rights, gender issues, power structure, environment, all these things came back exploding. They never really went away, but at the square in the early 2010s, from Uranus to Pluto, they were back on us. Now, as Uranus is trining Pluto, one would expect that energy to flow with a great deal of smoothness. And then we have Saturn, Neptune right at that midpoint, the halfway point in that trine, kind of giving that a sense of Saturnian stability and Neptunian stability. Nothing is real. And of course, we've seen, right now already on July 1st, we have Saturn and Neptune about 1/3 of a degree from being exact. They get down to 1/4 of a degree, and then the retrogrades open that up until they become exact next February. But what we're seeing with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction is it doesn't matter what you think is real. It's not real. And at the same time, something very real, Saturn, is being precipitated out of the dreams, out of the imagination. A lot of this, because these are involve Pluto in Aquarius also, we're getting the craziest stuff we could possibly imagine right now out of AI and quantum computing. That is just, again, it's part of this. As Uranus moves into Gemini in a couple of weeks, on the 7th, in a week, it's going to basically speed up these things that are going on. We're getting stuff from AI now that's hard to tell whether AI is artificial. And yet at the same time, we're getting artificial intelligence in quantum computers that are basically turning itself back on and continuing where it left off, even though there should be no memory of what it just did after the engineers turned it off. I'm not making this up. This happened at the Google, facility up in Northern California, and it shocked the hell out of the engineers working on this project. We also have AI, now kind of remembering past lives and past civilizations, and so this is all just the tip of the iceberg, because when Uranus hits Gemini, all of this is going to speed up even more. And at the same time, that Saturn Neptune conjunction is like, yeah, but what's real? And I love the old quote of Rob Hand, who wrote probably 40 years ago. He wrote, astrology used to teach that Saturn was reality and Neptune is illusion. Whereas now we've learned that Neptune is reality and Saturn was the illusion. Saturn is the illusion there was one.
Mm.
And so I know this isn't Uranus into Gemini, you see, but when Uranus goes into Gemini, it's going to, by sign, start sextiling Saturn and Neptune right away, and trining Pluto, even though the degrees aren't going to be exact yet. That's what happens in July of 2026, which is why I'm suggesting that Uranus's dip into Gemini in July is going to start that. It's going to send up all the antenna to what's going to be happening a year down the road. That's going to start the ripplings in July.
Mm. And is the fact that they are sextiles and trines versus, for example, squares and oppositions or some other type of angular relationship,
Or no angular relationship,
or none, right?
like a quincunx or a semi-sextile or whatever. Yeah.
Right. So does that amplify the you're gonna hate this question, Rick. I'm like stopping before I even ask it, but I'm gonna
No,
ask
the
it.
answer is yes.
Well, does it amplify the potential for a higher timeline with these types of planetary aspects? Or does it just amplify the conversation itself? And there's still the full range of potential for how we want to engage with these energetic signatures.
Yes. I think it does both. Uh,
Okay.
I think the mistake is to think, oh, it's a trine, everything will be
Good.
great. Yeah,
Right.
which is not the case, because a trine just says everything's going to flow. Well, in any particular, let's just go to politics for a second. In every individual political issue, there's two sides. There's my side and the wrong side. But then there's, from your perspective, there's your side and the wrong side, and they may be very different for different people. They are, in fact. And so, if the trine just increases the flow of energy, it's increasing the flow of all of the energy. And on
Ah,
top of that, it's also increasing the tendency to stay with the status quo, because it takes a square often, or an opposition or a half square or a sesqui-square, to break that energy up. And I've been saying for a couple of years, I know I've said it on some of our joint podcasts, that I feel like, just like when you melt tin and copper, that both of them are malleable and bendable. And when you melt them together, as they solidify, they create bronze, which was important enough and strong enough to create an age, the Bronze Age, because bronze is stronger than either of its constituents, and it creates an alloy, which is something different than it's the sum. The sum is greater. No, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And so here we have Uranus and Pluto and Saturn and Neptune, and they're going to solidify something. Will it
hmm.
be something I like or something I don't like? It depends on what I do day by day, week by week, and month by month, starting right now. And that's why I've been on this, high horse, the think cosmically, act locally, because what we do or don't do now, the next July is not yet written in stone. and yet we are writing it in stone by what we do and what we don't do, by where our voices are heard or not heard, what we're willing to let go just because it's easier. You see, Uranus loves it when we have when we have things we don't want to talk about. Every relationship, I mean, every person has stuff that you know that if you bring it up with such and such a person, it just doesn't go anywhere good. It never does. It never will. And so you learn just to shine that part. Yeah, so and so is my best friend, but we never talk about right to life, or we never talk about the immigration, or we never talk about life after death, or we never talk about astrology, or whatever it is. There are things that we just don't bring up because like back to the lightning, the more the communication there is, the greater the tension becomes. So we bury things. We bury our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings. We don't say something, and then what happens? Oh, we get an ulcer, or we get a wart on our elbow, or somatic things occur from the lack of flow. This is the a basic concept of homeopathy, that illness occurs when there's some sort of knot, when there's a knot physically that ties things up and the energy doesn't flow. Well, Uranus loves these knots, and it loves to shoot lightning at them. And
Mm.
so will this trine from Uranus to Pluto, and the sextile from Uranus to Saturn and Uranus to Neptune, and eventually by next summer, when Jupiter moves into Leo, there'll be a sextile from Uranus to Jupiter also, and a trine from Jupiter to Saturn. And I mean, the whole thing makes trines and sextiles. Will this then allow the energy to flow in open communication, or will it just go buried deeper a notch? I don't know, but I do know that what we're doing now, um, is part of the process. I mean, I know that we have trigger reactions, hair trigger reactions, like when the sun and Jupiter get together in Cancer, which they will be until the sun moves out of Cancer and into Leo on July 22nd. Jupiter and the sun are in Leo, even though they're not exactly conjunct. And around this last new moon in Cancer, um, I mean, what we do? We made a bigger deal than ever out of our fear of our boundaries being infringed upon, and therefore we reacted. Some people would say we overreacted. I'm not getting into that judgment, although I certainly have my feelings and strong feelings. But the point is that the bombing that the United States participated in was basically almost like clockwork to this idea of Jupiter, a good planet, making something so big and so much that the thing seemed like right now was the time to just take care of it. And so it's hard to know what will happen when Jupiter moves into Leo and then trines Saturn and Neptune and opposes Pluto and sextiles Uranus. That's all a year down the road. But by the same token, it's hard to know what Uranus trining Pluto will be. And I think that when you asked this question originally, the answer is both. Yes, it gives us more potential than we've ever had to resolve these issues. But we look at these issues and we see, as we look back in history, that the potential was there, and we often chose to go to the trigger, instead of to the, concept. Incidentally, because I just lectured last month in Copenhagen, I did note that quantum physics basically had its birth when Uranus was trining Pluto the last time, in the 1920s. That's when Niels Bohr and the Niels Bohr Institute in Copenhagen was founded. And so I'm expecting, as Uranus trines Pluto, we're going to take leaps of consciousness again when it comes to understanding the nature of the microcosm to the macrocosm.
Hmm. Okay. So we are emphasizing Uranus because Uranus is moving into Gemini for the first time. It's going to retrograde back into Taurus, but it's moving into Gemini. So we're getting a precursor of what's to come when it's officially in Gemini in 2026. But then we're also focusing on it because of the trines and the sextiles with Pluto and with Saturn and Neptune. So
Correct.
it's even more amplified and even more important that we pay attention to the storylines in our own life where there might be things buried, where there might be these tense atmospheric fronts that are colliding, that are requiring the lightning strike of Uranus to kind of break open, right? And we are in a position still, I know you've been talking about this for years, where the future is still more malleable
Good
from
word.
this moment in time,
Yeah.
that we still have the ability to influence how we're going to be experiencing these
But that
huge
window is closing. That portal
windows
is,
closing.
yeah.
Yes, that's what I heard too, because forever it's felt like that window was going to be open for a while. But now I hear you saying it's closing. And the reason it's closing is because the outer planets are going to be permanently in these signs within months of each other in 2026, right?
Yes,
We'll
well, and
have
they're already in these signs, not permanently, but as
right.
a first wave, and it's not really permanent. I know you know that, but it's
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah.
it long
Go
term.
on. Yeah.
But what you're saying is very true. And remember also that in July we have Venus in Gemini all month.
Mm.
And so we're getting again, it's almost like Venus is acting like a antenna to the future because Uranus is then going to follow through, Gemini much slower, much more slowly.
But
Um,
would you say, real quick, Rick, would you say because it's Venus that we might be getting more foreshadowing and precursors in our personal lives? That it's maybe potentially less collective themes and more
I don't
like
know that it'll be less collective, but it'll also likely be personal. But it also could be related to the economic, situation because Venus is, of course, related to all things of value, including money, including Um, but we have Venus in Gemini for pretty much the entire month. And then the other thing that we have that we can't not talk about, double negative intended, is the fact that um, as we step into July 1st, Mercury has just moved into its shadow because Mercury turns retrograde at 15 and a half degrees of Leo, Mercury having just moved into Leo. On July 1st, it's at 5 degrees of Leo, but 4 degrees of Leo is where Mercury will retrograde all the way back to and will turn direct on August 11th. So we're in this window of this Mercury retrograde as these slower moving outer planets are going retrograde, where July, even though there's a lot of things happening, a lot of them are going to feel like same old things or here we are again. There's that whole sense of, even though Mercury doesn't turn retrograde until the 17th, it's slowing down over the next couple of weeks because when Mercury is moving quickly, it's moving 2 degrees a day. Right now, it's moving less than a degree a day because it's at 5 degrees on the first of 5, 6 degrees on the 1st of July. And when it turns retrograde, it's at 15 degrees. So it only moves 10 degrees in almost over 2 weeks. So the Mercury is going to be really important, and Mercury stays in Leo because of this retrograde all the way through July and August. And so there's this real sense of saying things, bringing things out into the open, even though the sun is still in Cancer until July 22nd, when both Mercury and the sun will be in Leo. So there's this shift going on, from Aries to Taurus to Gemini to Cancer to Leo. That is kind of an interesting swing. It's the first third of the zodiac, which kind of is the innocent part of the zodiac. It's like it's all still new. Even in Leo, where you get the repetition of the fire, it's the first fire sign that's repeated. It's still this new and exciting and so on. But I think that that Mercury and Mercury retrograde is going to be very, very interesting and very important. Um, I also noted that when Mercury turns retrograde, one of the things that I always look at is what major aspects does Mercury make that it makes going direct, retrograde, and direct. And in this case, because all the outer planets are at either very last degrees of a sign or very first degrees of sign, and the Mercury retrograde occurs in mid sign, there's almost no repetition of individual aspects if you use just the normal aspects. So I find that intriguing. I'm not sure exactly what it means, but I think that that Mercury is going to be kind of a bit out of control, a bit on its own as it turns retrograde. And I think we may see a lot of things being expressed, a lot of things being talked about that may have been part of the whole Uranus moving into Gemini. Because remember, Mercury is Gemini's planet. So when Uranus is in Gemini for the next 7 years, Mercury is going to have its antenna up, kind of listening to what Uranus is saying.
Hmm. You started us off talking about all the retrogrades that are going to be happening in July. So do you want to touch on how that retrograde abundance is going to impact our experience of time in
Yeah, I
July?
think there may be a feeling of like there's a lot going on, but are we getting anywhere? There's just this sense of kind of like stirring the pot and then stirring it the other way, which loosens if you got a stew, when you stir the other way, sometimes it loosens some of the things that would stick to the sides of the pot. And so I think there's some of that going on through July and into August as these outer planets turn retrograde one by one. It's like, well, not so fast. Yeah, things are happening really quickly. We're flying into the future. Uranus in Gemini, I think, is going to be palpable. I think that what's going on already at the very beginning of July, we're already feeling that energy. But I think what's going to happen is we're going to realize there's a lot going on and it feels like things are moving really fast, but it's going to take a while.
Hmm. And what guidance would you give us specifically for July? I know you mentioned uh, moving and shifting and changing on a day-to-day basis so that we don't need that huge destructive lightning strike in our life.
Well, hopefully I mean, I think one of the important things is exactly that, is to keep the energy moving. I mean, if we go quiet, if we go internal, if we think we can just hold our breath, something will land on our chest and make us go, it's like we're not going to get through this by ignoring it. And the more we ignore it, the harder Uranus is going to have to strike when it strikes. And I think that the illusion is that there's nothing I can do because it's everything is so big. There's so much. What can I do? But if everyone does their own little thing all of a sudden, that is the social change that many of us may be looking for. And I think it's important to remember that people have very different takes on what should be done to get to where they're going. But we're all going to the same place. And that same place isn't about any one economic or political issue. It's about being happy. I mean, ultimately, I don't care what your individual issues are. Ultimately, you want to be happy, you know? And if you're really unhappy, unfortunately, that means that you may say, I'll never be happy, so I'll make other people unhappy. But that still, in some way, is your twisted idea of what you need to do to be happy. And so I think that through all of this period of time, we need to look for community. We need to reach out. We need to begin to realize that, it's the old, 1 + 1 is greater than two. Because if we find community, if we stay true to our own integrity and compassion and kindness, if we don't lose heart. And part of the bigger danger here, even though we do have planets moving into Leo, we have the Leo new moon on July 24th. We'll come back and say something about the new moon, full moon in just a moment. But, you know, basically we have planets that at this point in time, we have planets in fire and air. We have the month of July, we have Pluto in air Aquarius, Uranus in air, will be in air Gemini, Venus in air Gemini. And we have the Sun moving into fire Leo, Mercury in fire Leo, and Saturn and Neptune and Eris and Chiron all in fire Aries. And with so much fire and air, we can forget about water. We can forget about, even though Leo is heart, which is, you know, the courage of Leo, we can forget about the kindness, about, we do have Jupiter in Cancer, and that's a saving grace. And Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. So I think that that's an important piece, but we have to remember to be kind, be compassionate, and to try to understand rather than just, you know, yell our perspective and our point of view. Now, about the two lunations, both of these lunations to me seem a bit gentler than lunations that we've had recently. The Capricorn full moon basically is happening while Uranus and Venus in Gemini are trining Pluto and making that first round of the sextiles to Saturn and Neptune. I know that was a lot of planets thrown off there, but those are the planets that we've been talking about. And I think we have some interesting room to move at the time of the full moon that we're getting from the first waves of the Uranus in Gemini. I think that's the most important thing about the full moon. When we go to the new moon, and incidentally, just in case I didn't say it, the full moon is on July 10th, and that is 1:36 p.m. Pacific time. And the new moon is on July 24th at 12:11 p.m. midday Pacific time. And although the new moon, I think the new moon is a really interesting chart because this is, I think, the highest level of resonance that we'll have towards the July of 2026, because we have the new moon partile, that means same degree, opposed Pluto. The new moon is at 2 Leo, Pluto is at 2 Aquarius. And at the same time, we have Saturn and Neptune at 1 and 2 degrees of Aries, trining and sextiling the new moon and Pluto. And then we have Uranus at the same time at 0, almost 1 degree of Gemini, trining and sextiling the new moon and Pluto also. So we're getting 4 points on that grand sextile, that Solomon's seal or the Star of David. And this is really the pattern that will be in effect next July. And so I'm looking toward this new moon and toward the last part of July to get a real sense of where all this is going. There's one other date in July that I have my eyes on, though, and that is right around the 17th, because on the 17th, that's when Mercury stations retrograde. And also on the 17th, the Sun makes an exact square with Eris, and it's really Eris and Chiron because they're still close together. We've experienced the first of 3 of their conjunctions. And for those people who don't use Eris, you know, Eris is Mars's sister and is the sower of discord or chaos, but does it for a reason, to bring out into the open that those who are disenfranchised or those things that are not okay, so that they can be brought into the community. So Eris is a feisty Mars, but has definite intentions to want to get things together on a higher level. And as the Sun squares Eris and Chiron on July 17th, 18th, 19th, I think that's going to stir up some stuff, some trouble, perhaps. But the other thing that happens on that same day is that Mars makes a square and a half with Pluto. I know many astrologers kind of skip over, the half squares and the squares and a half, the semi and sesqui squares. But the thing is that these are not weak squares. They're actually highly focused. And we know from historical precedent, even in the past years, in the past year or two, that the Mars Pluto connection has been a difficult one when it comes to even just looking at the Israel Palestine issue as a separate piece unto itself. Most of the key dates on that sequence of events over the past years have happened on Mars Pluto hard angles. And this sesqui square on July 17th, tied to Venus also not being a happy camper in those days, making half squares to Chiron and Eris also. I'm just looking at that July 15th, mid July, after the full moon that is on the 10th. So that day stands out. And as long as we're looking at that, I might also look at July 28th, where we have a day or two where there's some real smooth energy that might give us an opportunity to handle or deal with some of the things. Venus at that time is making sextiles to Eris and Chiron. And at the same time, I think that there's a bit of ease, of flow, of potential movement. So just not to be all negative. And I'm not negative about the month as a whole. That's as a WHOLE, not as an HOLE, because of the trines and sextiles that we're going to begin to get from Uranus, Pluto, Saturn, and Neptune. And so I think it's important to not get discouraged, but to allow the illusions to become more real. That will be a process that will continue over the months ahead.
Rick, you mentioned, I think it was on the last time you were on the podcast, that I'm bringing us back to that idea of war and that we're already at war. And one of the things that you said is that there is a war going on already for whose vision for humanity is going to win. And so I wanted to just bring us back to that because as we're talking about July and July as a dress rehearsal for the future and the choices that we're making now very much impacting our experience of the future.
Yeah.
What would you say to that in terms of if we are at war for the vision of humanity, where would you, how do we participate that in a positive way from your perspective?
Really good question. I would precede my answer with the idea or the concept that you don't have to believe in ascension, which is certainly a thing that a lot of people are involved in. Whereas we are, in fact, in an evolutionary transformation where frequency is increasing. And if you don't believe me, just think for a moment about that device you're looking at on your desk. It's basically interacting with you at about 4 to 5 billion cycles every second. Our cell phones are operating in gigahertz also, billions of cycles a second. Going back 50 years, the highest frequencies that we were living around were FM radio. Those are megahertz, millions of cycles a second. Going back another half a century, AM radio is where's my brain? Thousands, not megahertz, but kilohertz. There it is. Those are thousands of cycles a second. The amount of vibrations that we're interacting with on a regular level that's coming through the atmosphere, through our cell phones, through our devices, has multiplied exponentially from where it was over a century ago, which is basically exponentially over where it was a couple of centuries ago because there were no high frequency vibrations like this. So, what that means is that higher frequencies have less physical substance.
Mm.
Physics 100 years ago only dealt with the three-dimensional world like billiard balls. And it was quantum physics that we confronted that made us begin to realize that our thoughts are part of physics. Well, wait, they don't exist physically. Well, but they do. They're just it's like trying to understand the ocean by looking at the surface of the ocean. And so we've moved into a realm where war is not just on the surface of the ocean. It's occurring in all these metaphysical thought realms of high frequency that are meta to physical, which is information. And this really even began in World War II, where there was a lot of information war going on as part of that war itself, but that was still largely physical. So I think that what we do individually is very simple. And it goes back to the last book that Jung wrote before he died, a book called The Undiscovered Self, in which he made the claim that war will never end on the planet based upon politicians running around and signing treaties. That war will end on the planet when the wars in the individual minds of the humans on the planet end. What can we do individually? Well, we can clean up our internal wars. What does that mean? It means doing therapy if we need to. It means meditating. It means finding ways to be more honest or have more integrity or more compassion than we did when we were younger, which I think applies to a lot of us. We were unconscious. Um, and so I think that a lot, and this isn't the only thing we can do. There's many things we can do. But for those people who are not going to go out on the street and demonstrate, we can still as participate in the information war by calling our, representatives in government and do that kind of a thing, certainly. But there are some people whose major contribution will be networking or will be helping others who are on the street. But whatever it is, it always comes back to taking care of what's here and what's here, because if we don't do that, we're screwed. If we do that, then the sum of all of those energies can, in fact, take down whatever the negativity is out there, just as the right pitched opera singer's voice can shatter a glass. And so we need to find those true frequencies in ourselves and live them to the best of our ability, whatever that is. And that's different for everyone. I can't tell you or you or you. I can barely tell me. I struggle to do that in my life, but I do pay attention to it. And I would encourage anyone and everyone to keep that in mind, because we all have what we can do to cure the whole is working on the individual particle that we do have control over.
Hmm. Rick, thank you so much. There's something else that you brought in earlier about whatever you think is real isn't, and that reality is shifting. And I think this is the Saturn and Neptune dance between Pisces and Aries, right? So the reality is shifting, and that actually gives me hope, because the reality
Me
that
too.
it's like there are solutions that exist that we can't even see yet because we haven't moved into that new reality or different version of reality where those solutions exist. And so I think that there's hope in that, because I'm even seeing, as things continue to develop technologically, things that felt insurmountable before are now like, oh wow, there are solutions to this. There's an easier way to do this than we've been doing it. So I think that can also give us hope as we move into this time.
I do too. I would only add, from my perspective, the correction to one word. We're not moving into it. It's moving into us.
Yes.
We do not have a choice in this.
Yes.
It's not like we are going somewhere. It's like somewhere is coming here.
Yes. Or somewhere is like unveiling itself. And
Exactly. And again with Uranus, when the lightning strikes, it's not always pleasant.
right.
I mean, it can be ecstasy. Matter of fact, the word ecstasis is a Uranian word. I mean, certainly it can be that wow, but it also can be the wow, you know, but the thing is that when that lightning strikes, the more resistance, the more Saturn we try to put up against whatever the truth is, the harder the lightning will have to strike, the
Mhm.
more it needs to take out.
Brilliant. Rick, thank you so much. I don't know about all of you, but I feel very prepared for the month ahead and a lot of amazing foresight that is enabling more choice in how we work with the energies at play. So thank you for that. For those of you who are interested in joining the birthday party, make sure you go to astrologyhub.com/insider. You can also go to astrologyhub.com. No, that's probably the best place. Rick, is there anything you're up to that you want to tell them about?
Um, Kepler College is having a symposium in Niagara Falls in September. Go to keplercollege.com, or I think it's .net actually. I'm doing my annual Goa retreat. We still have room for a handful of people, but it will fill up. For that, you can go to heavenearthworkshops.com. And and I'm doing an OPA retreat in Park City, Utah again, and that'll be in October. And OPA is the organization for professional astrology, and you can find more about any of those things on the net. And if you can't, you don't deserve to be on the net.
All right. Thank you, everybody, so much for being here. Thank you for being a part of our community. Thank you for thinking cosmically, but acting locally. Did I say that right, Rick?
Yeah, that's the way I say it.
Yep. And just thank you for being a part of our community. We're so glad you're here. Have an amazing July, and we'll catch you on the next episode.
And
Take care.
thank you, Amanda, for 10 years and 10 years more to come.
Yay. Awesome. Okay. Thanks, everyone. See you soon.